People often point to the Pontiac Aztek as the car that literally killed Pontiac. Imagine all that history of design and engineering, decades and even generations of building cars for people and for families, only to go out with this horrific thing. And yes, there is a parallel between the demise of Pontiac and the demise of Walter White and his famed Pontiac Aztek, particularly the fact that this car looks like it's on meth. But this is not a car video, this is a motorcycle video, and today we're looking at bikes that did the same thing as the Aztek. They killed their company. Now, I have to say, just so you're not taking this all too literally, there's rarely one single reason a company goes under, and the same is true of these motorcycles. There are always other factors, from things like poor management and vision, lack of money, just bad luck, poor management and vision. But in the cases we're looking at today, the bikes designed at the end of these companies' runs absolutely played a part in their demise. So grab a thick, juicy cup of strong black coffee, because things are about to get nasty. Grab yourself a peppery Bloody Mary, because it's about to get spicy. Okay, the first bike on our list is an oldie. This is the Ariel Leader, or the Ariel Aero as it ended up being later on, and boy, is it a peach. We're gonna focus on the Leader, as it truly is one of the ugliest motorcycles of all time, but it's more than just looks. Ariel was a British motorcycle company that specialized in making fast, innovative, highly engineered motorcycles and just classy, beautiful bikes. The famous Ariel Square 4, for example, was designed and created by the famed Edward Turner before he went over to Triumph, and this was a 4-cylinder motorcycle in the 1930s that was well ahead of its time. I talk about this bike in my video on motorcycle engine sounds that were way ahead of their time. Ariels were motorcycles for the motorcyclists. They were big, fast, appealing, often expensive. So when Ariel decided that they wanted to change up their business model and start competing with the Japanese brands in the late 50s and early 60s by making small displacement moped sort of motorcycle things, well, yeah, it didn't go well. This was basically the last motorcycle that Ariel produced, and no doubt Ariel would have been able to keep making motorcycles at least until the death of all of the other British motorcycle companies in the 70s, but they decided to off themselves early with this monstrosity of a thing. Not only was it downright ugly, some would say horrifying, and I'm not kidding either. Pedestrians would see it rolling down the road and they would literally run for cover. It just didn't have the reliability of the Japanese small displacement bikes, and honestly, it just didn't know what it was. It was too powerful to really hit the scooter market, but it simply had no appeal to motorcycle riders. So Ariel closed its doors in 1965 with the Aero as their last model, a bit of a variation on the Ariel Leader. I guess it's better, I guess so, but not much. Number 2 on our list goes to the Bimota Vdue. Now, not only is this one of the worst motorcycles of all time, it's arguably the worst named motorcycle of all time. That's right, Vdue. Like, what? That just sounds like a prenatal term or something. Oh, when are you due? Oh, well, I'm not due, I'm Vdue. So anyways, this is the bike, and I wouldn't say that it single-handedly killed the great Italian boutique race motorcycle company known as Bimota, but it certainly didn't help. I like to live by this motto that sometimes you should just not try to innovate. That's really the lesson learned here. This was the first electronically controlled direct fuel injection on a 2-stroke motorcycle. And though it was unbelievably fast in terms of power to weight ratio, like the fastest bike of its time, and really a beautiful bike, this fuel injection system, well, it just didn't work. Let's put it that way. The bike was also Bimota's first entirely in-house creation, like in terms of the engine and everything, and so the hype for this bike was massive, but it just didn't work. From things like seized pistons to power delivery problems, most of the rich dudes who bought this thing when it came out just literally returned it. Now, I'm not sure if Bimota had like a Costco level sort of return service, but yeah, the bike was a failure. Bimota closed its doors shortly after, in part due to the Vdue's basic suckiness. All right, next we have the oil-in-frame Triumphs. Yes, you heard that right, oil-in-frame. Triumph's demise was arguably inevitable, and even as it tried to innovate in the early 70s, their impending doom was already there. But in the early 70s, they decided to basically seal their fate with a new oiling system called oil-in-frame. Now, there were many problems with this new innovation. It wasn't entirely a bad concept, it just didn't work initially, and it wasn't enough to keep the bike on par with, for example, the Japanese sport bikes of the time, because it just didn't work. There was always significantly less oil in the bike at all times than before, and I can say from owning a 60s Triumph, that thing needs a lot of oil. Like, the oil tank is enormous and it holds a crazy amount of oil, and that's because these bikes leak oil. The new system of having oil in this new massive frame also meant that the seat was significantly higher. The seat was raised all the way up to 32.5 inches high. That is a high seat height and not accessible for the vast majority of riders, especially in the early 70s when the average American was about 7 inches shorter than they are now. Triumph would keep making bikes through the 70s, and they kept the oil in frame Bonnevilles even as sales plummeted. The company would close its doors in the early 80s, and one example of just how not right these bikes are and how not appealing they are is, even though they're better bikes than the bikes from the 60s in terms of a lot of the technology, from things like disc brakes and electronic starts, there's just the simple fact that they're not collectible. Everybody wants the earlier Triumphs. I wanted an earlier Triumph, so I bought one, because even though they weren't as advanced technologically, many consider them better motorcycles. Like, they certainly were better to look at, I know that. All right, next on the list is the Buell 1125R, and this is the last series of motorcycles produced by Eric Buell under Harley's ownership. This bike was incredibly innovative and unique for its time. It was fast, powerful, incredibly torquey, and just so unique in terms of like a sport bike. Buell was just making such incredible bikes. And more importantly, this was the first Buell bike not built on the Sportster powertrain. This was an entirely new engine, and this bike had a 72-degree V-twin with 4 valves per cylinder, and it produced just shy of 150 horsepower. So incredibly fast for 2007. And the two main problems were it was unconventional in terms of design for a sport bike. Basically, it didn't have that full fairing, kind of looked like a Tuono actually, and people just didn't like it. And second being the engine, which was Buell's first in-house engine, and it just had some problems, especially at lower speeds. Ultimately, the bike costed so much more to produce than what it brought in for Harley, and a few years later, Harley announced that it was ditching Buell, to the sadness of many American sport bike riders and really motorcyclists all over the world. Having an American sport bike was just cool, even if it was a bit weird. Now, I don't think that this bike was the main reason or the sole reason that Buell was shut down, but it certainly played a massive part in Harley's decision. All right, last on my list is a motorcycle that I actually own, and it's not the Triumph that I talked about earlier, because that bike certainly was one of the best Triumphs that they've ever made. This is a bike made by a company known as Sunbeam, and it is the Sunbeam S7 and S8. In my case, my bike is kind of a mix of a Sunbeam 7 and an S8. Mainly, it's an S8 though. And I'm actually going to switch over to me in my garage to explain this bike to you guys and why this bike played a huge part in Sunbeam's demise. All right, guys, this is my sort of wannabe garage room thingy. And as you can see, there's multiple motorcycles. We've got a tiny little pocket rocket that my son is obsessed with. We've got the old Triumph, but the bike I wanted to show you is this project bike right here, which is the Sunbeam S8. And the engine came to me when I got this bike out of the bike, and I'm about to put it actually in the bike. This is an old British bike, a 70-year-old British bike, and as you can see, it's a bit of a mess. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to this project, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. I didn't really want to talk about the project so much. Here you can actually see a picture. This is like a metal sort of thing, like a metal poster of what the bike is supposed to look like, although this is a Sunbeam S7 and my bike is a Sunbeam S8, so there's a few differences, but it's pretty much the same bike. But yeah, this was essentially the last bike produced by Sunbeam, and it was, yeah, it had many sort of failings along the way. One thing that they did that they failed at that they actually fixed was it was vibrating so bad. And the first people who rode it literally couldn't ride it. Like, it was unrideably bad in terms of vibration. So they actually rubber mounted it, and I believe it's one of the first motorcycles to ever be rubber mounted. So you can see on the engine things like this. These are those rubber mountings, and there's a bunch of them, rubber mountings like right here and right here, and it was kind of innovative in that way. The bike was really a knockoff of the bikes that BMW was making at the end of World War II. Sunbeam was already bought by BSA at this point, and BSA wanted Sunbeam to make essentially the bike that BMW was making that was coming into the UK, that people were buying and people honestly were loving. And they tried, and it's not that this is a bad bike when it's running and in good order. It isn't a bad bike, but it's nothing compared to what the BMW was at that time, in all honesty. So it was not powerful at all. It's a 500cc twin, but really couldn't go hardly faster than 60 miles an hour. And it just didn't compete. You had bikes like the Speed Twin, for example, at this time that were going 100 miles an hour and were just way better motorcycles. And so ultimately, it was the last bike that Sunbeam produced. And they closed the doors, I believe, in like 1953. And this bike was produced in 49. And hopefully someday I'll be able to get this bike running with this engine in it. But yeah, don't mind my mess. But anyways, Sunbeam, last bike produced by the company, not really the bike that the people wanted. It was still so old school, like it just looked so old. And when you look at bikes from 49, 50, bikes like the Vincent Black Shadow, and like I said, the Speed Twin, they just look so much more modern, not so bulky and thick. Like the tank on this thing, look at the gas tank on this thing. It's just absolutely massive. These fenders are huge. Everything is old and it's heavy too. It's so heavy. But yeah, it's been a fun project for me. I really like it and hopefully I can get it running someday. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. We'll see you in the next one. And yeah, there's a pocket rocket. Anyways, we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.